I will hide. You come and seek, discovering the unknown in common malwares using memory forensic by Shyam Sundar Ramaswami will be our next interesting talk. Shyam is a lead threat researcher at the Cisco Umbrella Threat Intelligence team. Beside his job at Cisco, he is an experienced speaker on several international security conferences. A teacher, he taught a class on advanced malware attacks and defense at Stanford University, and also a mentor for students all over the globe on cybersecurity. Shyam, please.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction. And good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today's talk and thanks for giving your time. So that was a wonderful introduction. Always when someone introduces me, I make sure I try to keep up and do better each time when somebody introduces me. So welcome to my talk. I will hide, you come and seek, discovering the unknowns in the known malwares using memory forensics. So that's my talk today. So we're going to talk about a lot of interesting stuff. I'm going to keep it simple, a little bit of complex, and then probably gradually go inside the talk. So it's going to be enjoyable, and don't worry about any prerequisite for this talk, but because you're probably going to go really interesting and deep and make it fun. So, sorry, that's me. A huge Batman fan, to be honest. And I went all the way from India to Los Angeles to see all these things. I'm like a huge fan. So that's my book that you see on the cover, which is actually called It's Your Digital Life. I'm a co-author for this book. You can find it in Amazon. Just give it a read. It's from CRC Press. Pretty interesting is what people have told me. So look forward to your support on this. So I'm also a two-time TEDx speaker, and I'm a huge malware and memory forensics person. So you can find my stuff in YouTube. So that's one thing. So just a second. So cool. Sorry about that. So let's get started. So sore throat. So okay, what happens when you start a cyber attack? You always have a professor. If you're following Money Heist, the guy who robs the bank and gives you a lot of plans of how to do it. There's always a bunch of masterminds behind every cyber attack. So every cyber attack has two paths. One is data stealing, and one other way is innovative ways how they can stay persistent. So persistence means how they can hide inside the victim computer or continuously stay like an advanced persistent threat attacks, which they go undetected. So the goal of this entire talk that we are probably going to do today is two things. We're going to see for the first 5 to 7 minutes how a normal process of malwares have evaded and evolved in this pandemic space. And second, what we're going to probably see is how we're going to solve these advanced malwares using memory forensics and what it's all about. So I'm just going to show a bunch of, the known stuff in the first 10 to 5 slides about the new malware imaging techniques and why we go for memory forensics. So that's the reason I have these slides here. Cool. So where do I start? So everybody knows what like a malware is, right? Now, a malware is basically a small piece of program that runs on your computer, which takes input, which is your data, and gives the output back to the attacker, right? So that's the whole place of how the malware works. It's a very small program and a simple program. But what exactly happens is we or human beings are the reason for malwares getting into a computer. You end up downloading Word documents or emails or free software. That's the way it actually makes it in way to your computer. You might have $1 trillion or $1 million cybersecurity, solutions, products, or policy or a framework. But end of the day, what actually happens is you are responsible for clicking on something. So we're going to see how these things happen in the next upcoming slide. So what you see here is a very, very common technique that's been happening throughout the pandemic and post-pandemic or before the pandemic. Just a pattern, right? What you see on the screen is actually called as a mal spam. Like a malware with an email attachment is actually called as a mal spam. And what happens with the mal spam is malwares have evolved over a period of time. So like back in the day when I used to be a teenager or like a school kid, I used to play games. When there used to be a malware like 20, 22 years back, it used to slow down your computer. And you probably know that something's happening with your computer, something's wrong. But what has actually, changed, to be honest, is the whole process of how malware works. They have come to a point where they evade antivirus, they are silent. And this is one classic example of how business email compromises, we usually call this, or mal spam, where you get an email, you end up opening the Word document, and then you get infected. I'll probably explain quickly how this happens before we jump into the memory forensics section. But first things first, right? This is a common 75% of email-based attacks either have a doc or a PDF or an Excel sheet attached to the email, which helps you to bypass the whole process. I'm going to talk through how it actually happens. So here's how we're probably going to go here, right? This is how your Word document looks. It's a classic technique, right? The first things first that you actually see here is like enable editing. And when you have enable editing means it's not safe. The reason behind this is what I'm going to probably show you, right? When you press this enable editing, whatever is under it is probably going to execute. I would reiterate the fact that malware is nothing but a small piece of program that's going to run, or a set of instructions. Now that is what is actually going to happen right here. So you will have something under the hood here, but when you press on this, you're probably going to get infected. Now, what exactly is going to happen there? This is what probably I'm going to talk about, right? What you see on this is actually called the jack in the box. Now, what happens with the jack in the box is when you press on this, string or the screw or the mechanism here, the joker or the jester is probably going to come out of the box, popping like this, right? That's how it's probably going to come out, right? Now, what is the similarity between this and a Word document? Well, something funny, right? Every time when you probably open this, whatever is under this is programmed logically to open and pop up like this. When you push this back inside and wind it back, it still is going to come look like this and come out like this. Now, that's exactly what you call as a macro. Okay. Now, what happens is whenever it's automated, whenever you click on this, and whatever program or a logic or code under this is probably going to execute. So what actually happens with Word is something really surprising, which is actually called as a macro. An automated process, when you open this, it's going to come out. When you close it, it's probably going to go out. Now, this was actually built for a good purpose, for spreadsheets, formula, marketing, sales, and of graphs and interesting stuff. Now, what the threat actors decided to do was, if I send a malware right with my email, my antivirus is probably going to detect it, right? Now, how do I evade this? What if I put a small piece of code, which has got a URL, and that's under this enable editing? When I press that, this document is probably going to download the malware from the internet. Since this is admin, nobody's going to suspect this process. Now, that's how it actually happens. So you open it, boom, the malware comes and sits in your temp directory. Now, one such interesting example is, do you see this auto open? Now, this is actually the keyword. Now, this auto open sits, right under this enable editing macro button. When you press this, the macro gets executed, which in turn calls this keyword when this is the program that's going to run. So this varies from malware to malware. This actually steals your information about your name, your domain, a bunch of stuff. Usually what happens is you have a URL, like a website or a domain name with a file that gets downloaded to your temp directory. Cool, right? Now that's how macro and auto open works. Now the story so far is we're talking about Word documents. When you open the Word document, it's going to drop a malware that's going to run on your computer because it's in admin mode. And it uses a bunch of something like PowerShell, or it probably uses WMI, a Windows Management Instrumentation Control. These are all administrative, a bunch of commands and tools that are actually used by administrators to control computers remotely. But what happens with these threat actors is all automated. So this is how it actually happens. So this is how a Word document executes. And sometimes there could be no macros. And what could actually happen in this whole thing is you can actually unzip a Word document. Now, when you unzip a Word document, you can see the settings of a Word document like the separate folders. Okay, it's all configuration based stuff for a Word document to know what is what, where is where. Now, what exactly happens with a new set of malware is the URL that I was actually talking about is not there in the macros, but it's inside this folder. The moment you open the Word doc, it's going to look for this folder file, and it's quickly going to go out and call out this URL. The trick is the same: Word document, downloading something, putting it in the temp and executing it. Word document, downloading something from the internet when you open it. Now, what are the similarities? Why are we coming? When you open the Word document, it just looks like this, plain blank. You can see a thing here. This is pretty shocking, right? Now, what exactly are we trying to achieve here, right? Now, when you see here, you're not able to perform analysis sometimes on these files. These files sometimes sits inside a memory, or they're not on the disk, which is actually called as living off LAN. I think we had a session today which spoke about LOLs, living off LAN binaries, right? Now, what do you do in such cases when these guys unload or offload into the memory, or fake a behavior of the malware? A bunch of things. That's why we do something called as memory forensics. That's why I had these slides in the first 10 slides or 15 slides for this very interesting reason. So how do we study malware usually, right? The malwares are really fast, right? They just run like this too fast. You can't catch them. You need a boundary to study these malwares. Now that's what you do when you have a boundary, right? Put the malware into a box and you monitor it with a camera. So the baby's not going to run out anymore. Now, what are you going to do here? Now, that is what we call sometimes a sandbox. A malware runs inside a container environment with no internet connection for various reasons, because we don't want the malware to call home and infect your LAN. But for this small reason, we would probably don't want an internet connection here. Now, we are going to look into some key 4 terms, and then we're going to jump directly into our memory forensics part. Before we want to perform analysis on any malware or memory forensics, these are the things we need to know before we focus on forensics, or these are the things we probably would look into when we do memory forensics. What are these things? This is just specific to Windows because we're going to talk about Windows forensics, memory forensics, and Windows malwares. Now, first is like the process ID. Like everything that runs in a computer has a process. Now, the process ID is actually like a token number, okay? Now, everybody gets a token number when we pick up food. So when they call your token number 242, just put your hands and say, hey, dude, that's me. So similarly, in a computer, especially in Windows, every process has a process ID. So you can note the process, identify the process using the process ID. The next is the process memory. Okay. Now, everything inside Windows, any process has a memory. It's very similar to a locker space, right? Now, take this number 29. Let's take this as the process ID, like a locker, and every locker has a storage space, right? If you have access to this 29, you have the access to the storage space too. So similarly, whenever you have a process ID, the process ID has a memory which we need to inspect. That's what we're going to see in the upcoming slides, how to do this part. The next is actually Windows API. So it's like a master chef kitchen. If I probably want to cook food, right, in a master chef, I'm not probably going to take all the ingredients with me. Instead, I write that in a piece of paper. And then I take that, the recipe, and then I go to the kitchen and take that stuff. That's exactly what you call it as Windows API, okay? So you do not take everything with you. Every malware, when it runs, will call the Windows API or the functions it's want to use. So you can look at the Windows API and see what the malware is trying to call and what it is trying to do when it behaves. So that's another sweet little trick that you can actually follow when you do analysis. And the important part is registry, who came in, who went out, it's like how you write it. Windows maintains a registry of what actually happened step by step. And you can query the registries to see what exactly happened. And finally, network communications. It's like tapping the phone. So you know which process called to the internet, which IP address or domain or URL, you can tap all of these things there. Okay. Now, these are the key important things that you probably should know when you perform memory forensics or any forensics: the process ID, the process memory, and the Windows API registry, and then the network communications. Now, these are the common traits in every malicious process. You have a process, it calls out to the network, and it's got a Windows API. Now, why are we going into these memory forensics concept is about the evasion and the antivirus evasion part. Now, what I'm about to show you is about a malware. When we perform the normal analysis on the computer by putting it in a sandbox, putting it in a sandbox, it did not reveal its true behavior. It was hiding something. Now, that's why we went for something called this memory forensics. Now, we're going to use two little interesting things here called as volatility and recall. In the interest of time, I'm probably just going to show you volatility. Volatility is a Python-based framework that's going to parse your memory images and run through all the data structures with its plugins to give you forensic evidence of how a malware is going to be. So in Windows, everything is memory-based. And every memory in Windows is basically like a doubly linked list or a linked list or a set of pointers. Now, everything has a handle, a pointer that points to a specific memory location. If you find out the process, its handle, where it is pointing to, you can actually access the resource to see if it's deleted, if it exits, or where it resides. That's the beauty of memory forensics. Doing it manually is pretty hard. That's why there was a framework called volatility that was actually written. Recall also works, but we're going to see volatility today. So you have to keep reading the memory entirely in memory forensics using volatility as a tool. Now, this is your traditional sandbox that you see. So usually when you run a malware on a sandbox, you're probably going to see what the file is, what the process is, where is it calling, what it is doing, and a bunch of stuff. Now, especially in this malware sample I'm going to show you, they were actually hiding a lot of these network connections, URLs, some of the process details, and a bunch of that. So whatever you see on the screen that you see, right, this IP address, this process number, the name, these are called as indicators of compromise, or IOC. Now, we're probably going to talk about Orcus RAT, remote access Trojan, which basically exhibited a fake behavior when it ran, the normal process in a sandbox. We did memory forensics to find out what were its true behaviors and something really, really strange. Now, that's what probably I'm going to talk about right now. So this is what I told you, right? You look for the process name, the network connections, bunch of stuff. We're going to do all of this inside a memory of a computer, and how is what forms the rest of the talk, which is memory forensics. Now, what do we do? Now, as I mentioned, everything that we're going to do is probably going to run on a sandbox, which is actually a virtual machine. Now, the virtual machine, actually what it is, it's like hosted on a computer, does not talk to the internet. And you can save the state of a virtual machine using something called as snapshots, right? At a point of time which you probably want to save your work and you want to do parallel stuff, you would use something called as a snapshot. Now, we need to convert the snapshot to something called as a vmem, which is a memory file. When we do that, that's what we're going to use in our entire talk. And for this analysis, I've converted a snapshot to a vmem file and have used that vmem file for this talk. So what I'm going to use in the talk, we're going to have a demo in the end, but before that, I have a bunch of stuff to show you. What we are using here is something called as Remnux. Now, Remnux is actually an open source forensic investigator machine, which sits on the top of an Ubuntu. You've got tons of free tools. Volatility is there installed. So you can probably go to the internet, Google for Remnex, and go grab a copy of a Remnex's virtual machine build, and you can start using it. Now, that you see on the screen right now is actually called as a mem dump that you see here. What I actually did was I took the dump or the snapshot of the infected machine. So what I did here was I took the malware, Orcus RAT, and I put the Orcus RAT and the Remco RAT flavors of the malware inside this computer, a Windows computer. I ran the malware for like a minute and a half. And then I took the snapshot of the computer or the dump of the computer of the memory, and I converted it into a mem file, which means I've converted the state of the machine to a mem file for my analysis. So that's what I actually done. So I've cut short the process, the slides for that. Now, what we can do basically, first things first, right? In a Windows computer, there are 3 memory images you can actually perform analysis on. One is the method that I showed you right now, which is actually a mem file from a snapshot. The second thing that you can probably use is something called as a page file. And the third is actually a hyper file. I'm going to talk about the hyper file in the end, but the first things first is the page file. Now, what exactly is a page file? If you go to your Windows, you can actually and obviously see the page file here. Now, the page file and the sys file basically are 2 important files. Now, paging is used as a virtual memory, right? When you have a lot of physical memory getting occupied, you use virtual memory by the RAM to swap stuff. It's basically a virtual memory used by Windows. Now, why we investigate a page file here is basically it contains a lot of forensics evidence in memory forensics. Sometimes when a program execute or malware execute, it would swap between the virtual and the physical memory. So it's good to take a look at the page file sys to see if we have any known patterns or something that is of a good forensic evidence. Now, there's a tool actually called as a page brute. Now, the page brute actually helps you in brute forcing the memory or the page file. It's a Python-based tool that actually helps you to brute force. Now, how this actually works is it takes the page file.sys file and the page file and breaks into 4 KB bytes of chunks. And each of the chunks, it actually runs something called as URL rules. I'll talk about that in the next slide. And if it finds a pattern in each of the blocks or the chunks it splits into, it's going to give you the signature saying that, oh, dude, I see a command shell, I see a PowerShell, I see a artifact HTML, a bunch of these files. Now, that's the first step to forensic evidence. Usually we do. We use these small tools before we deep dive into the manual analysis factors. So these are small things that helps you to go in a direction to see if there are any unknowns or knowns and unknowns and so on. So what are exactly YARA rules? So YARA is actually a Swiss Army knife. Most of you guys should be knowing about this or would be knowing about it. So it can scan anything like memory files against specific patterns. So you can take an email and run it against the YARA rule for some keywords to flag it or a file or a memory section, anything of this sort. This is one of the rules that I wrote for one of the Office documents. So this rule basically checks the Office documents if it's got some keywords like download, mon, and auto open so that we can flag a file. Now, similarly, if we could write rules, we could write those rules and scan against this sys file. So that's one way of doing it. So this is the first analysis that we actually do using memory forensics. If you do get hits, well, pretty well and good. If you don't get hits, don't worry about it. We have another way and several other ways to flag this file. Cool. Now, the first things first is basics of volatility. Now, volatility is a Python-based framework that's there inside your Remnox you can use. Now, volatility basically takes the file, which is your dump that I spoke about, as an argument that actually could be a sys file, could be a page file, could be anything. And I actually converted the snapshot to memory, can be raw format also. And then we're going to run the first command, which is actually called as image info. Now, there's something really, really tricky here, and you need to understand it. Now, volatility will not understand the version of the Windows unless you tell it. Now, how do we find the version of Windows? Because we need to tell volatility which tables, which sections, which parsing needs to be done against specific version of Windows. Because each Windows varies with the layouts, its documentation, the process, and a bunch of things. Now, volatility roughly guesses the profile. How it finds out is what I'm going to talk about. Now, there's something called this image info command that you type in volatility. And the image info probably tells you, there's a bunch of things. It uses something called this KDBG search. I'm going to tell about that in the next slides or upcoming slide. But first things first, how can we find out what's the memory? What's the version of Windows here? There's actually something called as a hex editor. And if you type the hex editor, you would actually locate something called as the KDBG. Now, what exactly is this KDBG? Now, this KDBG is a very interesting block in Windows, which holds a lot of key information like the version of the Windows, the process list, and a bunch of things. Now, this KDBG has a sequence of letters which spans across, it starts here and probably ends here. Now, each of this is actually called as a magic value. So if it's probably says 33, then it's actually XP. If it's 43, it's Windows 10. If it's 07 and, something 44 or 42 of that sort, it changes with versions. So volatility has a dump or a list of these Windows versions from the hex editor. So it parses the KDBG value from the hex, and then it's able to decide which is the version of Windows. And that's how it's actually able to guess here. One of these things could be the answer. This is not always right, but this KDBG is really, really important. I'm going to tell you why. Cool. Now, what happens with this KDBG is the KDBG is what is going to contain the kernel modules that are loaded, the list of running process, and a bunch of version information. Now, this is really, really critical for us to perform analysis, but unfortunately, Windows 8 Plus has encrypted KDBG and you cannot see what's inside it. So if it's less than Windows 8, it's not encrypted, but if it's more than Windows 8, we have to do a following of the memory hops and the linked list and the data structure, the pointers, the address. That's got a different mechanism to do it. But this is what KDBG does. So very, very important. First things first, right? The first thing when volatility checks for things, it actually looks at the KDBG because it needs to get the list of running process. Cool. So what actually happens in this case is now we're going to go into the mind of the attacker. Now we're going to perform memory forensics right now, but what are the things that we're going to go after? We're going to go after the process, the memory of the process, the DLL, the network connections to see if there are rootkits or hiding information. These are always the key things that we would look because these are the things that the attacker is also going to do. So you're going to go to the mind of the attacker and say, dude, I'm going to follow the process, memory, DLL, and the network connections. Now, the first command that we use, as I said, is just, I'm going to show all of this as a demo, but just running through this slide so that you find it useful. So I'm going to ask for the list of process. There's a command called PS list that we're going to run against volatility. Now, that's what is actually being shown here. Why do we do this is because to see if there are any malicious process that was executing when the memory image was acquired. Now we're going to scroll down to this. I'm going to show that in the next section. And the next thing we are probably going to do is something called as the PS tree. This is really, really important because any process anomaly can actually be spotted here. What's the example for process anomaly is every computer should have only one system process, which is the parent process or the starting process. And this should follow exactly the same tree. This system should not come under probably an svc host.exe, then it's actually a malware. That is why we check this kind of, this is system tree to it. And that's what we keep checking here when this is PS tree. We know who's the parent process with the child process, and you know the process ID, the threats, and then the handle. So we want to know who's our candidate. And as I said, we would inspect the process ID and its memory later. So next thing is we scan the process for the list of process from the KDBG using the PS scan. So sorry, the PS scan. It's probably going to give you the process name, the block. The PDB is where's the process block. This is the memory location of where the process is located. And also it gives you the time created and exited. Note one thing, right? You should understand the time exited and entered because you can know when the malicious process started and when it exited during the time of capture. You can see that here. Now, we have two candidates. When we perform the memory forensics on these things, I have two beautiful candidates right here. One's an FTK imager and one something called as Orcus. Now, these I felt were suspicious process. Now, the process number is 2412 and 1408. I quickly Googled for FTK imager. I know about it just for you guys. FTK imager actually is, a memory capture tool. I'm sorry for the blurred screenshot. My Windows machine crashed, so I couldn't get the screenshot of this. So the FTK imager is actually nothing but a tool that helps you to get a snapshot or get a memory dump of a computer. So which means when the malware was running, somebody used FTK imager, which is me, to get the memory dump of the computer. So this is verified. This is actually suspicious because these are all Windows process. And why do we have something called as the Arcus.exe, which is strange. Now note, 2412 is the process we are probably going to follow. Okay, make a note of this number. This is what we're going to follow throughout. So this is what we're going to go after. Cool. Now, before we deep dive into that particular process, right, we always need to use this psx view command in volatility. Now, why are we using this is because this will help you to compare the output of different commands like pslist, pscan, and a bunch of commands. If you see a discrepancy in this output, it means it could be a rootkit. So rootkit is one that hides inside a computer, does not exhibit its normal behavior during analysis. That's why this is an X factor command to find the rootkit. If there's any discrepancy where it says false, false, true, 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 then this could be suspicious process. Cool. Now, what we're going to investigate in this is a bunch of things, which is going to process, mutex, threads, and events. These are the four key objects under the kernel object. In memory, we're going to observe something called as investigate something called as the kernel object, which comprises of mutex, process, threads, and events. So in the interest of time, we're just probably going to take a look at through things, which is process and mutex. Now, everybody knows what a process is, right? I showed you process as in memory. There's something really interesting called mutex. What exactly are we going to do? Now, we're going to look for hiding stuff inside something called as LDR data table, which is actually a physical memory. It's got something called pool tags. Now, basically what happens in these two things is which contains all the loaded, the unloaded modules inside the memory or the physical contents, right? Now, if we look at it, we would know what the malware deleted from the disk, what was loaded into the memory, which is not visible to us, so that we can perform better forensics here. Okay, now we are probably going to do something called as pool tag scanning, where we're going to scan all the pool tags of a memory. So every memory pool has a tag. You will know what was hidden, what was loaded, what was unloaded, and you look for some of these interesting allocations. That's what we're going to take a look at it now. Now, what I'm going to do is something called as the mod scan. Okay. Now, the mod scan, when you scan, it scans the memory to see what were the files and the drivers that were actually loaded. Because when we do a normal analysis, all of these are hidden stuff. So rootkits do a lot of hiding and loading and unloading. This helps you to take a look at that particular process. So, which is actually the file and the drivers that are loaded. You can do a decent bit of analysis on this. Cool. Now, this is the most important part, mutex and malware. Now, what exactly is mutex is malware authors leave a specific string in the memory and or on the disk, which means they don't want to infect your computer again and waste their time. So when they run in a computer, they check if there's a mutex like a code so that they would upgrade and not infect the same machine again. So what exactly actually happens? We have 10 minutes. Thank you for that. So I'm just gonna push now. So what exactly is gonna happen here is there's a plugin called as I showed you, which is like a mod scan, and you can also do a mutex plugin, which is going to show you this strings. It'll show you the list of mutexes load inside the memory. And if you take a look at this, it's like a popular mutex associated with most of the rats. So that's why we're able to find out that, good, this could be a rat because I see a mutex here. We've come a long way, right? We scanned the process, we found a malicious process, we looked into the pool tags, and now we find that looks like a rat tag. So whatever file we are analyzing probably could be a remote access Trojan. So we'll probably get into this part of how we can corrupt a running process. Process runs and suddenly you inject something bad, it becomes a malicious process. That's actually called as code injection. Now, you turn a good process into a bad process. And what actually happens is like a process will run in another process's memory. So it evades detection. So thanks to Brad for the image credits. So you have a process, the malware basically allocates memory inside another process. It copies the DLL or the malicious code and it actually, starts to run. This can also be found using memory forensics when you observe the memory if something was injected into it. Okay. So what exactly happens in this case is, this is about the APIs I mentioned, right? These were the list of APIs that were actually collected from the memory, what was loaded. So this will give you any sort of process injection or any combinations would also be spotted. Now, this is the most important part. Are you watching closely? We're going to show you something really, really interesting, which is called this hibernation analysis. Now, I showed you memory forensics on a page file. I showed you memory forensics on a captured file, and you can do memory forensics on something called as hibernation files. What are these hibernation files? So when you put your computer to sleep or hibernation mode, the computer Windows, which needs to store whatever was running inside the memory to something called as hibernation file. Now, when your computer goes back to normal from sleeping, all of the data could be pushed back to the RAM or to the temporary registers or like to the virtual memory when it comes back. Now, all of that data is stored in something called as hiberfile.sys. You can do forensics on hiberfile.sys by seeing the header of the hibernation file. If it's actually hiber, you can actually find out if it's an unrestored, which means the hibernation was in place, which means wake, which means the hibernation, it was up and running. 0 means it's a restored file. This is a critical piece of evidence that we use in forensics because sometimes malwares are really aware when you run tools. So what we do is we take another computer using WMI modules. We log in, which is actually a administrative tool. We suddenly run the computer and then we can, get into the computer and suddenly get this sys file. We put the computer hibernation mode. When you put it, there's actually a hibernation file that's been stored. We take that and do forensic analysis on that. That's one way of doing it. And you can also run the set of DLLs, which is actually called a DLL list with the paths to see which is a malicious DLL that was loaded. And you can also look for network connections using the netscan command, which tells which process spoke to which, IP address. So you can find out the malicious process talking to a malicious IP. Now, I'm going to talk about the dumping of the process in the demo and the dumping of the memory. Now, I'm going to stop talking and get into the demo time. Quickly go to a demo. You can still see my screen. Cool. These were like a bunch of commands I was actually showing you guys all this while. But I have something really, really interesting now. I have something really, really interesting now. So all this while we were doing forensics analysis on this machine. Okay. And then I told you we found out the profile was actually Windows. Now, what we're going to do is we found out that the process 2412 was the malicious one, because we found out from this set of commands here on the top. We ran the process scan. Yeah, we found out that this 2412 was the malicious one here, the Orcus, and we decided to proceed with this process. Now, in the event, we did something really interesting. We ran the plugin called as mutex scan, right? Which I told you gives you the list of mutexes. So when I ran the mutex command, this is what I ran after this process. Okay, cool. Yeah, we did the mod scan, and then I told you the mod scan gives you the list of drivers, blah, 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 which was interesting. And this mutex scan, right? I just read a mutant scan here, which showed me there was something which was related to a RAT, remote access Trojan. So we are behind a RAT right now, which is what we're going to chase and find out, which is this string here, is located at this location. So since it's a RAT, let's do something interesting here. What are we going to probably do here is, I know the process. I'm going to dump the entire process into the computer. So what I'm going to do is use the plugin called process dump, proc dump. I'm going to say, dude, in this memory image for this process ID, dump this process entirely inside my directory. So if I hit, it's going to run, and it's going to quickly dump the entire thing into your memory. Cool. Similarly, what I'm going to do here is actually, I'm going to say, dude, now you got the process. Can you give me the memory of the process? So I'm going to say, give me the memory of this process and dump it into my computer. Now, it's right. It sometimes takes time. Hopefully it does not. So I'm going to dump the entire memory of the process so that we can parse to the memory and see what exactly is actually happening. We still have 3 more minutes, or we have 8 minutes more. I think we have 8 minutes more, right? So good. 8 minutes. Okay. It looks like the time on the line. So, oh yeah, I know. Just 2 more minutes. I'm going to push. I hope this dump writes it. So what I did actually was, oh, thank God. Okay. So it gave me the dump of the process, and it gave me the process itself. Now, this is where we're going to do analysis. Do you see this? This is the dump of the memory. This is the dump of the process. If you do strings on the strings is a utility that you use like a static analysis to see what's inside the file without executing the file. And if I hit strings, you'll see a ton of stuff that was actually loaded into the memory and strings of this dump of this file. Okay. Now, some of these things could be really, really interesting. This is huge. Okay. It's like huge stuff. Now, some of these things, what I would probably do here is I'm just going to do probably a grep and then do a .com. Do you see there were a lot of these domain names that were actually hiding inside it, which was not exposed during the analysis in a normal sandbox. So I'm going to cut short it, and you see here like tons of stuff here, like a tons of certificates. It's probably checking your browser. It's got a lot of these, logins. These are different IOCs that were actually seen. So what it could have done probably was it could have read the browser of the victim's computer and would have dumped all the websites that he had served from those various browsers into the memory. There were some of these porn sites too, and some of very interesting spam sites that I observed. But these were different sets saying that, okay, this one's actually gonna peek into the memory and do a bunch of interesting stuff. That's one thing that we observed because of memory forensics. And next, probably we could do strings on the same executable. Oops, it's strings, pardon me. So this will probably talk about this is the API call that I was actually talking about. It's going to load something. It's going to do a bunch of interesting things. And actually, in the interest of time, it actually has a key logger that logs your keystrokes. And you see, it actually copies whatever's there in your clipboard data, and it sends it back to the attacker. Now, this concludes from the memory forensics that this is actually a RAT, a remote access Trojan, which we busted using memory forensics in a very smart way. These were things that we couldn't do much inside the reverse engineering. Something were hidden, encrypted, a lot of things. And if you see this Orcus commands, clipboard manager is basically a command and control, and it's like a keylogger. It copies your clipboard data and sends it back to the attacker using Orcus command. This is actually remote access Trojan. Now, these are the things that you cannot see in a normal malware analysis, which you can see inside the memory of a process using memory forensics and volatility. You can actually say do the same using Rekall, but it's a little bit more of a shell type of commands, which is pretty hard to understand at times. But this is one way of probably doing it. And what I did here was found out that this is the Orcus commands, and compared with what was there in the internet with my analysis, all of this is matching. It's a keylogger. It captures your webcam. It captures a lot of your, text chats. It uninstalls programs, installs new programs, and a bunch of stuff. Now that is how you bust a remote access Trojan using memory forensics. And that's the journey of how memory forensics is actually done on an infected computer. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. I hope you guys liked it. I think I'm bang on time. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to take questions. I hope you guys like it. It's really a complex topic, but I've tried my best to keep it really, really simple for everybody. So, yeah.
Thank you, Shyam.
Thank you.
Are there any questions? I have one question. Malware often checks if a debugger is running or if the malware is running in a virtual machine. While memory forensic analysis solves the first problem, the virtual machine detection problem still remains. Isn't that a problem for the analysis to get a good IOC in time?
That's a really good question, because most of these malwares, so it comes to the point where we talk about something, are malwares strangers or descendants? So what are we talking about is a particular family of malwares that do, and most of the malwares have off late copied it. So what they usually do is they check the adapter to see if it's a VirtualBox adapter, and they stop running. And they used to look at a set of tools that live in that, and they stop running. So that is why what we usually do is not all malwares check for virtual machines. That's why I told you the trick, right? We run the malware, not use these tools, and suddenly hibernate without the malware's knowledge. So that's where you get the hibernation file, you do memory forensics. Yeah. The other trick, what we usually do is we connect a Linux file with a Windows machine. So what we do is we run a set of WMI, Windows Management Instrumentation commands in Python from the Linux, and allow the malware to execute remotely on the Windows. When it is done, so that machine does not have any tools into it. When it's done, you immediately run a dump, or you hibernate the system, and you get the dump via your WMI. That's the only way to fool it. The worst case for such malwares that you have to probably go for a bare metal configuration, like run it on like a hard metal machine, which is not virtual. And yeah, because I've seen rats which used to check the computer temperature. So that does not happen on a virtual machine. So it quits itself. So yeah, that's a really good question. So it's a thin line, but that's the only way to probably solve this problem. So yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. It was an awesome talk for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. You can follow me on LinkedIn. Just Google about me. You want to find out about me, just type my name, Shyam Sundar, in Google. Give me a shout on LinkedIn. I would love to collaborate, talk to you, take questions offline also. But thank you so much, DeepSec, for giving me this opportunity. This is the second continuous year I'm doing it. Hopefully I do a hat trick next year. Third time is a charm. I come in person. So thank you guys for the opportunity.